The device recorded 21.3 grams of mass vanishing from the body in 4.6 seconds, and then the instruments detected something rising through the air above the table that should not have been there. Dr. Helena Marsh sat motionless in the observation room, watching the needle swing backward on a scale that had been calibrated 3 times that morning. And she understood in that moment that everything she had built her career upon was about to collapse. The laboratory went silent, except for the hum of machines that were now measuring something science had no name for. Before we begin, we would like to know where you are listening from. The Whitmore Research Institute stood on the northern edge of Burlington, Vermont, a brick structure built in 1947 that had once served as a tuberculosis sanatorium before being converted into a private medical research facility in 1972. By the time Dr. Helena Marsh arrived in the spring of 2016, the building had become a place where experimental protocols too sensitive for university oversight were quietly conducted, funded by private endowments and overseen by a board that valued discretion above publication. The windows on the 4th floor were always covered. The elevator required 2 separate key cards to reach the upper laboratories, and the work conducted there existed in a grey space between legitimate science and something the broader medical community would have called ethically unacceptable. Helena had been recruited specifically for her work in bioelectric field measurement, a niche discipline that studied the electromagnetic signatures emitted by living tissue. Her doctoral thesis at Johns Hopkins had focused on the electrical patterns generated by cardiac cells during the moment of arrest, and she had published papers suggesting that consciousness might leave a detectable electromagnetic trace during the final stages of biological shutdown. It was fringe work, the kind that drew skepticism at conferences and raised eyebrows during grant reviews, but it was also the kind of work that attracted attention from people who operated outside the traditional academic structure. The man who hired her never gave his full name. He introduced himself as Dr. Collier, showed her a portfolio of funding that had no clear institutional origin, and told her she would have access to equipment most researchers could only dream of. The only condition was absolute confidentiality, no publications, no conferences, no discussion of methodology or findings with anyone outside the facility. She would be studying death, he explained, in ways that had never been attempted before. And if she found what they suspected she might find, it would change everything. She accepted the position on a Tuesday in March. By Friday, she was standing in a laboratory outfitted with sensor arrays she had never seen outside of classified military research. The equipment was extraordinary. There were electromagnetic field detectors sensitive enough to measure the electrical discharge from a single neuron. There were precision scales capable of detecting mass changes down to milligrams, mounted on vibration-isolated platforms that eliminated interference from building movement or air currents. There were thermal imaging cameras, infrared sensors, atmospheric pressure monitors, and spectrographic analyzers that could detect shifts in air composition at the molecular level. The observation room was separated from the main lab by reinforced glass, and every surface was grounded to prevent stray electrical interference. It was a space designed to measure things that existed at the very edge of detection, phenomena so subtle that most laboratories would have dismissed them as instrument noise. Helena spent the first 2 months calibrating the systems, running baseline tests, and establishing protocols. She worked alone most of the time, though occasionally Dr. Collier would appear with questions about her progress or adjustments to the experimental parameters. He was interested in one thing specifically: the moment of death. Not the medical definition, not the cessation of heartbeat or brain activity, but the actual moment when whatever constituted a human being stopped being present in the body. He wanted to know if that moment had a signature. if it could be measured, if something left the body that could be detected by instruments. Helena knew the history. She knew about Dr. Duncan McDougall, who in 1907 had attempted to weigh the human soul by placing dying patients on industrial scales and measuring mass loss at the moment of death. McDougall had reported a loss of 21 grams in his first subject, a finding that had been sensationalized and then discredited, dismissed as methodological error and wishful thinking. But Dr. Collier believed McDougall had been onto something, and he wanted Helena to revisit the experiment with modern equipment and rigorous controls. The first subject arrived on a Thursday in late May. Helena was not told his name. She was not told his medical history. She was informed only that he was a terminal patient who had consented to participate in end-of-life research and that his death was expected within 72 hours. He was brought into the laboratory on a specialized bed frame that had been mounted on a platform scale, the entire assembly isolated from vibration and calibrated to measure changes in mass down to 1/100th of a gram. Surrounding the bed were electromagnetic sensors, thermal cameras, and atmospheric monitors, all linked to recording systems in the observation room. Helena would not be in the room with him. She would watch from behind the glass, recording data as his body shut down. The man was unconscious when they brought him in, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin the color of old paper. An intravenous line delivered saline and medication to keep him comfortable, but there was no resuscitation equipment, no crash cart, no intention of intervention. This was not a hospital, this was a laboratory, and the man on the bed was not a patient. He was a subject. Helena watched him for 16 hours before anything happened. The room was silent except for the soft beep of the monitoring equipment and the hum of the ventilation system. The sensors recorded baseline data, body temperature slowly declining, electromagnetic field output from his heart and brain gradually weakening, respiratory rate dropping from 11 breaths per minute to 8, then 6, then 4. The scale showed his mass as 73.42 kilograms, stable, unchanging. Helena sat in the observation room with a notepad and a thermos of coffee, watching the monitors and waiting. At 3:47 in the morning, the man's breathing stopped. Helena leaned forward, her hand moving to the recording controls. The cardiac monitor showed erratic electrical activity, the heart struggling to maintain rhythm. The electromagnetic sensors registered a sharp spike in field strength around the chest, then a sudden drop. The thermal cameras showed his core temperature beginning to fall. And then, at 3:49 and 12 seconds, the scale reading changed. It dropped by 18.6 grams in less than 5 seconds. Helena stared at the display, her breath catching. She checked the calibration logs, scanned for vibration interference, reviewed the atmospheric pressure data. There was no external cause. The mass loss was real. Something weighing 18.6 grams had left the body at the moment of death. She sat in the observation room until dawn, reviewing the data, running the numbers again and again. The mass loss was consistent across all 3 redundant scale systems. The timing correlated exactly with the cessation of brain activity, and there was something else, something she almost missed in the initial review. The electromagnetic sensors had registered a brief, localized distortion in the field directly above the body, a fluctuation that lasted 0.8 seconds and then dissipated. It was faint, barely above the noise threshold, but it was there. Dr. Collier arrived at 8 in the morning. Helena showed him the data. He studied the graphs in silence, his expression unreadable, and then he told her to prepare for the next subject. The second subject arrived 3 weeks later, a woman in her 60s with late-stage organ failure. The protocol was identical. Bed mounted on the scale, sensors arrayed around the body, observation from behind the glass. Helena had refined the equipment settings based on the first experiment. increasing the sensitivity of the electromagnetic detectors and adding additional thermal imaging angles. She wanted to capture everything. The woman died at 2:13 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The mass loss was 19.2 grams. The electromagnetic distortion was stronger this time, a clear spike in field strength that lasted 1.3 seconds and moved upward from the chest to a position approximately 40 centimeters above the body before fading. The thermal cameras detected a brief cold spot in the air above the woman's head, a localized temperature drop of 3.1 degrees Celsius that appeared simultaneously with the electromagnetic anomaly and then dissipated. Helena watched the playback 17 times. There was something there, something that had mass, that interacted with electromagnetic fields, that caused a measurable temperature change in the surrounding air. It appeared at the moment of death and then vanished, moving upward and outward in a way that suggested intention or directionality. She began calling it the departure signature. The third subject arrived in August, a man in his 50s, brain death following a massive stroke. The mass loss was 20.1 grams. The electromagnetic distortion was even more pronounced, a sustained field fluctuation that the sensors tracked for 2.7 seconds as it moved upward through the space above the body. And this time, there was something new. The spectrographic analyzer detected a brief spike in atmospheric ionization, a localized increase in charged particles that had no identifiable source. Helena added more sensors. She brought in high-speed cameras. She installed additional electromagnetic detectors at varying heights above the bed, creating a three-dimensional array that could track field distortions in real time. By the fourth subject, she had enough data to construct a preliminary model. The departure signature appeared within seconds of final brain shutdown. It registered as a localized mass loss, averaging 19 to 22 grams. It produced an electromagnetic distortion that moved vertically at a rate of approximately 15 centimeters per second. It caused measurable thermal and ionization effects in the surrounding air. And it was consistent, 4 subjects, 4 signatures, all following the same basic pattern. Dr. Collier reviewed her findings and authorized an expansion of the study. More subjects, more data, more precision. Helena worked through the fall and into winter, refining the protocols, tightening the measurements. She documented 12 departure signatures by the end of December, 15 by February, 20 by April. The data was undeniable. Something left the body at death, something with mass, with electromagnetic properties, with physical presence. She had measured it, she had tracked it, and she had no idea what it was. The scientific literature offered no explanation. Mass loss at death had been reported before, usually attributed to the release of gases from the lungs or moisture evaporation from the skin, but those processes occurred over minutes or hours, not seconds. The electromagnetic distortions did not match any known biological phenomenon. The thermal and ionization effects defied conventional thermodynamics. Helena was documenting something that should not exist, and the more data she collected, the more certain she became that she was measuring exactly what Dr. Collier had suspected from the beginning. She was measuring the soul. The word felt absurd when she first allowed herself to think it. She was a scientist. She dealt in empirical data, in measurable phenomena, in results that could be replicated and verified. The soul was a religious concept, a philosophical abstraction, not something that had mass or electromagnetic properties. But the data did not care what she believed. The data showed a consistent, repeatable phenomenon occurring at the moment of death, a physical departure of something from the body that could be detected and measured by instruments. Helena began to notice changes in herself. She stopped sleeping well. She found herself staring at the monitors during experiments, watching for the moment when the sensors would spike, when the mass reading would drop, when the thing she had started calling the soul would leave the body and rise into the air above the bed. She started to feel like she was watching something she was not meant to see, something private and sacred that should not be subjected to measurement and analysis. Dr. Collier seemed unconcerned. He pushed for more subjects, more data, more refinement of the detection systems. He wanted to know if the signature varied based on age, gender, cause of death. He wanted to know if it could be detected earlier, if there were precursor signals before the moment of departure. He wanted to capture it on video, to create a visual record that would be undeniable. Helena installed the cameras in late March. They were high-speed units, capable of recording at 1,000 frames per second, positioned at multiple angles around the bed. The imaging was infrared and visible spectrum, synchronized with the electromagnetic sensors and the thermal arrays. If the departure signature had any visible component, the cameras would capture it. The 23rd subject was a woman in her early 70s, end-stage heart failure. Helena watched from the observation room as the woman's breathing slowed, as her heart rate dropped, as the monitors began to register the final shutdown of biological systems. The cameras were recording. The sensors were active. Helena's hand hovered over the playback controls, waiting. The woman died at 11:51 in the evening. The mass loss was 21.3 grams. The electromagnetic sensors spiked. The thermal cameras registered the cold spot, and on the high-speed video footage there was something visible. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a distortion in the air above the woman's chest that looked like heat shimmer, or the ripple of light through water. It appeared at the moment of death and moved upward, rising through the space above the body in a smooth, continuous motion. The distortion lasted 4.6 seconds, tracked by the cameras as it ascended to a height of approximately 60 centimeters above the bed, and then it faded, dissipating into the air as if it had never been there. Helena played the footage back in slow motion, frame by frame, watching the distortion rise. It had structure, it had coherence, it moved with purpose, and it was real. The cameras had captured it. The sensors had measured it. She was looking at something that had left a human body at the moment of death, something that had mass and form and presence. She sat alone in the observation room until dawn, watching the playback over and over, and she realized she was crying. Dr. Collier arrived the next morning with two other men Helena had never seen before. They reviewed the footage, studied the data, and then they told her to stop the experiments. No explanation, no discussion, just an immediate cessation of all research and a directive to secure the data and prepare it for transfer. Helena protested. She argued that they were on the edge of a breakthrough, that they had documented something unprecedented, that they needed to continue. Dr. Collier listened in silence, and then he told her the decision was final. The laboratory was decommissioned within a week. The equipment was removed. The data files were transferred to encrypted storage. Helena was offered a substantial severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that prohibited her from discussing any aspect of the research, ever, with anyone. She signed the agreement because she had no choice. And then she left the Whitmore Research Institute for the last time on a rainy afternoon in April, carrying a box of personal belongings and a memory card hidden in her jacket pocket. The memory card contained copies of the high-speed video footage from the final experiment. It was a violation of the non-disclosure agreement. It was theft of proprietary research data. Helena did not care. She had spent a year measuring something that should not exist, and she was not going to let it disappear into a classified archive where no one would ever see it. She spent the next 3 months trying to find someone who would take the footage seriously. She contacted colleagues, former professors, research institutions, and independent laboratories. No one wanted to touch it. The footage was too controversial, the implications too extreme. Measuring mass loss at death was one thing. Claiming to have visual evidence of a soul leaving the body was career suicide. Helena was politely dismissed, Her emails went unanswered, and her phone calls were not returned. By July, she had stopped trying. She returned to academic research, took a position at a small university in Oregon, and tried to forget about the departure signatures and the thing she had seen rising from the body on the high-speed cameras. But the memory card stayed with her, hidden in a drawer, a physical record of something she could not explain and could not ignore. She thought about it constantly. She dreamed about the laboratory, about the sensors spiking, about the distortion rising through the air above the bed. She started reading religious texts, philosophical treatises on consciousness and the afterlife, accounts from near-death experiences. She was looking for some framework that could accommodate what she had measured, some way to reconcile the data with the world as she understood it. Nothing fit. The departure signature was too precise, too consistent, too physical to be dismissed as a metaphor or a psychological phenomenon. It had mass, it had electromagnetic properties, it interacted with the environment. It was real, and it left the body at death. Helena began to wonder if other researchers had found similar phenomena and been silenced. She searched through historical archives, old journals, forgotten case studies. She found references to unexplained mass loss, to electromagnetic anomalies around dying patients, to cold spots and light distortions reported by hospice workers and hospital staff. The reports were scattered, dismissed, buried in footnotes and appendices, but they were there. People had been noticing something for decades, perhaps centuries, and the scientific establishment had refused to acknowledge it. In September, she received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a woman who identified herself as Dr. Elaine Rostov and claimed to have worked on similar research at a facility in Nevada. She said she had heard about Helena's work through a mutual contact and wanted to compare notes. Helena was cautious, but she agreed to meet. They met in a coffee shop in Portland on a grey afternoon in October. Dr. Rostov was in her 60s, silver-haired and precise, with the demeanor of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating institutional politics. She told Helena that she had conducted experiments measuring electromagnetic fields around dying patients in the late 1990s and had documented anomalies that matched Helena's findings. She had also been shut down, her research confiscated, her career quietly derailed. She had signed non-disclosure agreements, she had been warned, and she had spent the last 20 years trying to understand why. They compared data. The mass loss was consistent, 18 to 23 grams, occurring within seconds of brain death. The electromagnetic distortions were similar, localized field spikes that moved vertically and then dissipated. Dr. Rostov had not captured visual footage, but she had documented temperature changes, ionization effects, and even faint audio recordings that suggested a high-frequency oscillation accompanying the departure. She called it the separation event. Helena called it the departure signature. They were describing the same phenomenon. Dr. Rostov believed that the research had been suppressed because the implications were too disruptive. If consciousness had a physical component that could be measured, if something left the body at death that interacted with the material world, it would upend foundational assumptions in neuroscience, physics, and philosophy. It would suggest that human beings were not simply biological machines, that death was not the end of information, that some aspect of identity persisted beyond the shutdown of the brain. Institutions built on materialist frameworks would resist that conclusion, and people with power would ensure the research remained hidden. Helena asked if she thought the suppression was coordinated. Dr. Rostov smiled sadly and said she did not know, but she had met 4 other researchers over the years who had encountered the same phenomenon and the same response. Their work had been shut down, their data had been confiscated, and they had been made to understand that continuing the research would end their careers. Helena asked what they were supposed to do with the knowledge. Dr. Rostov had no answer. She said she had come to terms with the fact that the truth might never be publicly acknowledged, that the evidence might remain hidden for generations. But she also believed that the data existed, that it had been collected, that it was real, and eventually someone would find a way to bring it into the light. They parted with an agreement to stay in contact, and Helena drove home through the rain, thinking about the memory card in her drawer and the footage of the distortion rising from the body. She had proof. She had measurements. She had documentation of something that should not exist, and she had no way to share it. She began writing, not for publication, not for an audience, but for herself. She documented the experiments, the protocols, the data. She described the departure signatures in clinical detail, the mass loss, the electromagnetic distortions, the thermal anomalies. She wrote about the high-speed footage, about the shimmer in the air above the dying woman, about the 4.6 seconds during which something had been visible as it left the body. She wrote about the implications, the questions, the terrifying possibility that consciousness was not confined to neurons and synapses, that it had a physical substrate that could detach and persist. She wrote for months, filling notebooks, creating a record that would survive even if she did not. And she thought about the 23 subjects she had watched die, the 23 departure signatures she had measured, the 23 times she had witnessed something impossible become real. Helena knew she would never work on the phenomenon again. The non-disclosure agreements were ironclad, the institutional opposition too entrenched. But she also knew that the data existed, that it was sitting in encrypted archives somewhere, that other researchers had found the same thing and been silenced. The truth was out there, fragmented and hidden, waiting for someone with the courage to piece it together and demand acknowledgement. She thought about Dr. Duncan McDougall, ridiculed and dismissed for his attempt to weigh the soul. She thought about all the researchers who had come after him, who had found similar phenomena and been shut down. And she wondered how many more would have to measure the same thing before the evidence became undeniable. The rain continued through the fall and into winter. Helena taught her classes, wrote her papers, and kept the memory card hidden. Sometimes she would take it out and watch the footage, the distortion rising from the body, the shimmer in the air that the sensors said had mass and the cameras said was real. She would watch it and think about the woman on the bed, about the moment when her breathing stopped and the thing inside her separated and rose. Helena did not know what it was. She did not know where it went. She did not know if it persisted or faded or rejoined some larger field of consciousness beyond the reach of instruments, but she knew it was real. She had measured it. She had seen it. And no non-disclosure agreement, no institutional resistance, no threat to her career could change that. The departure signature existed. The soul, for lack of a better word, had mass, and at the moment of death, it tore free from the body and rose into the air, leaving behind a corpse and a set of readings that science could not explain. Helena Marsh carried that knowledge like a weight she could never put down, and she wondered, in the quiet hours before dawn, if she was the only one still watching the data, or if somewhere in a locked laboratory, someone else was measuring the same impossible thing and asking the same unanswerable questions. The instruments had recorded it, the cameras had captured it, and the truth, hidden and suppressed and undeniable, remained waiting in the darkness for the moment when the world would finally be ready to see.